So when it comes to Ukraine, that would be such a significant, if he can force a ceasefire, which he's saying that he's going to do, that would be a hell of a start to his role as the next president.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale. Welcome to Times Radio's The Trump Report. Now, we are just days away from Donald Trump's January 20 inauguration, where he will officially be sworn in as the 47th president. This means it will also be the day Joe Biden finishes his 4 years as the 46th president of the United States. Donald Trump is inheriting a lot on his plate. The US has been helping to broker a peace deal in Gaza. Americans want less money spent on foreign aid and more spent on them. California wildfires have killed at least 24 people, burnt over 40,000 acres of land, and could cost up to over $100 billion. To put it simply, Donald Trump will have to hit the ground running. Joining me now for an in-depth analysis on some of these agenda points is former British Army Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thank you so much for your time today. A lot is going to be happening for Trump come Monday when he's officially inaugurated as the 47th president. One of the big talking points, as you and I have discussed so much, is how much money the US is going to continue spending on Ukraine. How do you think Trump is going to tackle this on day one?
Well, I think it's very clear that what happens in Ukraine is pretty close to Trump. He's talked about it a heck of a lot over the last sort of 6 months or so on how he is going to sort it out in 24 hours. As you've mentioned, there's an awful lot happening at the moment. You know, when I woke up on the 1st of January this year, 2025 looked pretty grim, but actually we've seen some positive steps. There is a possibility eventually we might have a ceasefire in Gaza, which the whole world will welcome. That might come before Trump takes command in the White House, but I am sure that his fingerprints and DNA are all over it, and certainly I'm sure that he will claim that. So when it comes to Ukraine, that would be such a significant, if he can force a ceasefire, which he's saying that he's going to do, that would be a hell of a start to his role as the next president. And I think it's possible. I think Trump has the political heft, he has the military might of the US to impose a ceasefire on both Putin and also to get Zelensky to agree. I think he has to impose it on Putin and get Zelensky to agree. So, yeah, and as you say, the Americans are fed up of spending trillions or billions of dollars on Ukraine. And if he can bring that to a halt, then all the better. So although there's a lot of ambiguity going around at the moment, you know, I am more upbeat this year than I was last year.
Well, I've been there through that, Hamish. You have been very scared of what will happen if Trump is elected, and now he is, and we're only days away from the moment that he actually is sworn in. But his newly elected National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, has said that the plan is actually in place for Trump and Vladimir Putin to have a phone conversation, which will probably happen within the first few weeks of his administration. How do you think that phone conversation will go?
Well, you've got to start off. You can see at the moment there is obviously negotiations to be had, and both sides are saying some, pretty extreme things, and it's difficult to sort out the wheat from the chaff. But I sort of back out what I say earlier that I'm more positive now. When you look at Putin has suffered some real major setbacks recently. He has been humiliated in Syria and had to scuttle out of there. That is a place that the Russians have invested tremendous amounts of resources, manpower, money in. That's all gone. They've lost it. Putin's right-hand man, Kirillov, was eliminated by the Ukraine Secret Service outside the Kremlin recently. And we understand that the Russian economy is in free fall, 21% plus inflation, interest rates through the roof. So everything is going badly. And Trump knows that Putin is a person who, he wants to leave a legacy. He wants to be seen as one of the great Russian dictators. But Putin knows that a failed dictator in Russia doesn't last very long. So I am hoping that he sees this as an opportunity. And whatever we think of Trump as a great statesman, he is good at doing deals. And it strikes me there is a deal to be done. And the final bit on this, everybody is focused on Zelensky. Whatever deal has got to be acceptable to the Ukraine people. But Zelensky also knows that ultimately he and the Ukraine people want to be part of NATO. And they want to be in a position that they can do that. And if he is too hard over on any ceasefire deal, then that is going to be more difficult. So the stars are not aligned yet, but they seem to be getting into a better position. It
does seem like a delicate dance that Trump thinks that he's the only leader that will be able to do. But Hamish, what does Donald Trump need to be careful about when it comes to Vladimir Putin when they enter those talks? Because you said Putin's had a lot of losses as of late. He's got a lot riding on him. Will he use that to his, as ammunition to really take this forward and kind of play into Trump a little bit?
Well, undoubtedly, Putin is a pretty good strategist, and certainly until his special military operation in Ukraine, 24th of February 2022, a lot of us thought that he was, one of the great military strategists. And I think also, Trump, until fairly recently, has, suggested that, there might be a way out for Putin. And I think also fairly recently, Putin was looking forward to a Trump presidency because he thought he'd get more out of Trump than he would Biden. And
Ukraine would get less.
Entirely. But the whole music is changing. And it's, obviously, Kellogg, his sort of advisor in this area, and Waltz and others, within the Trump team, lots of people seem to be saying slightly different things, which is a bit confusing. Maybe ambiguity is a good thing here. But, I think the main thing is that Trump is looking for that early big win. And this is a real opportunity to do it. And there is a lot of talk on how this might go into fruition. The ceasefire, the buffer zone, lots of talk. Actually, at the moment, the British forces might be used to do it. So at this stage, we're not going to really know until he's had that phone call next week, whenever it is, when Trump actually has his hands on the big, powerful US state and military to know exactly what's going to happen. And we're going to hear a lot, I think, in the next few days from both sides. But I'm still positive that we might get some sort of resolution.
And if this does happen, it just plays into Trump's, ongoing narrative that he's the only guy, the only person that can, broker a peace deal with Putin, the only person that can speak to Putin. But Hamish, Mike Waltz, he said in an interview this week that in order to kind of broker these deals, you need to be having open dialogue with the other side, being Russia. Now, we know that President Biden hasn't had direct, relations with President Putin since the invasion in February 2022. They've never spoken. Trump's team thinks that needs to change in order to broker this deal. From your experience, do you agree that there needs to be this dialogue between the two leaders?
Well, I think there are two things here. First, your first question is, can Trump do this? Well, I mean, yes, the US can do this. I mean, the US military is almost more powerful than all the other militaries in the world put together. So he absolutely has the firepower, if you like, to make this happen. And Putin knows that. Although the states have spent billions supporting Ukraine, their actual military commitment is, there's still so much more to come. And I think that, to me, is sort of what Trump is saying to Putin. You either come to the table and we have a deal now, or, get ready for a real hammering. And the other thing about negotiation, of course, I mean, somebody a lot cleverer than me said, keep your friends close, but your enemies even closer. And we know that. I mean, in the Northern Ireland Irish conflict, we always had a dialogue with the IRA. In Afghanistan, we always try to have a dialogue with the Taliban. You must speak to your enemy to try and, because, without that, you're at a severe disadvantage. So certainly I'm a bit surprised that Biden hasn't spoken to Putin, but I would be really surprised if the American administration has not been speaking to the Russians. In a similar vein that I expect, the Brits are as well, and I expect people are talking to the Chinese and everybody else. Dialogue is absolutely fundamental, and maybe that lack of dialogue created the conditions that Putin invaded in the first place. Although, having just spent a week in Syria, where the Obama red line, when Obama said any use of chemical weapons would cross the red line and I'd do something about it, and the West didn't do anything about it, I think that emboldened Putin, in 2022 to invade Ukraine in the first place, because he looked west and he didn't see a conventional deterrent, and he didn't see leaders who would actually stand up and do anything. Maybe if Trump had been in position, then it would have been different.
I mean, you and I have discussed the use of chemical weapons in this Russia-Ukraine war, and we've spoken about how there isn't a lot of media attention on the fact that that the Kremlin are using chemical weapons on Ukrainian soldiers. Why do you think it is that you don't have the United States coming out, you don't have Geneva coming out saying that this is illegal?
Well, that is a great question. And having just come back from Syria, where I investigated the use of chemical weapons for 10 years, and I went to the site, last Wednesday of the biggest chemical attack in a place called Ghouta that killed 1,500 people. And the West, led by Britain, decided to do nothing, and Assad remained in power for another 11 years. You then wind forward to now, and Russia is using chemical weapons on an industrial scale, having a real impact. I think the slight issue is that the chemical weapons the Russians are using are riot control agents, CS gas, if you like, which used across Europe all of the time. And there's a slight ambiguity, but actually they are termed as chemical weapons, and they have the same effect. So it's I think it's one of those really difficult areas, and one that perhaps the West likes to turn a blind eye to, and all the focus is on Putin's nuclear weapons rather than his chemical weapons. But we've discussed before, in my opinion, he can't use his nuclear weapons, so focus on the chemical ones. So it's very complex. But going back to your original point, it's all about dialogue. And without dialogue, you're unlikely to get resolution.
And I don't know how detrimental that lack of dialogue between Putin and Biden will be on Biden's legacy, because we know that every past president is thinking about their legacy. We've obviously recently had the death of Jimmy Carter. It's all about what a kind person he was. And obviously Biden will still have that. But Trump's sitting here looking ahead. He wants his legacy to begin from January 20, when he tries to end 2 wars. But moving on, Hamish, during the 2024 presidential election, it was made very clear that Americans thought that the government was spending way too much money on foreign aid and not enough on home soil. They've had obviously a massive economic problems in the US, across the world. We obviously have had wars, we've had COVID-19. There's varying factors to that. But the problem lies that they want less money spent on Ukraine, in Israel, wherever it may be. Do you think that the Trump administration will take this into consideration, whether or not there is peace deals brokered in both Ukraine and in Gaza?
Well, I mean, that is an issue for virtually every country.
Yeah.
In this country, people want more money spent on the NHS, on cost of living, et cetera, et cetera. And defence is sort of like, it's a discretionary. You don't get any physical out of defence. If the government's spending money on winter fuel allowances, you're getting money to keep the fires burning in your house. But if they're spending it on defence, you don't necessarily see anything. And that is an issue in the States very much. And of course, the US under Trump is very much more an inward-looking country. It's make America great again, not make the world safer again, sort of thing. So spend money internally rather than externally. However, as the argument in this country is the same in the States, if you can't keep your enemies at arm's length in the Middle East, in Russia or whatever, you're going to have to deal with them at home, and that is a very real prospect. So it's going to be a balance for Trump. I think you make a really interesting point about his legacy, and dare I sort of put words into Trump's mouth? I think, almost the legacy in his own mind is probably, more important to what people think in downtown Arizona or wherever it is, on the sort of job he's doing. So from an international perspective, I think for us outside the States, then that gives us some solace that he will do the right thing. And there is this opportunity at the beginning of his second presidency to make a real difference. And, I'm sure he doesn't want to hang up his boots in 4 years' time like Biden has, and, some of the other presidents who've not really shifted the dial.
Yeah.
It strikes me that Putin really wants to, that Trump really wants to shift the dial so that he has some sort of legacy apart from, what generally people in the world think of him and his, flashy jets and cars and hotels sort of thing.
Complicated legal cases. If the conversation with Putin doesn't go well for Trump and the war is still ongoing, but he can't fathom spending that much federal funding on Ukraine, how detrimental will that be for Ukraine?
Well, on the face of it, without anything else happening, of course it is. I've just been having a conversation with some others about, wouldn't it be better for the war to go on another year to completely destroy the Russian economy and destroy the Russian military, which is, that might be true, but for, as a humanitarian, that also entails probably, a couple of 100,000 people being killed, which, that is not worth it at all, I think, in any stretch of the imagination. So I think, we're just going to have to see, how things react by this. But without the American firepower, that is so significant. I do sympathise with Trump when he looks at Europe and some people are only spending 2% of their gross domestic product, on defence. And during the Cold War, the UK was spending sort of 5% on defence. So we are in a Cold War again. So why aren't we spending 5%? And if he does go isolationist, Europe's got to pick up we have got to really do that. We have got to turn our, ploughshares into swords and tractor factories into tank factories. So it is behest on us supporting the Americans as much as possible, because we cannot allow Ukraine to fail. If Ukraine falls, and we've discussed this many times, we'll be at war anyway. So we've got to do all we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
And if this war is ongoing and it takes months and months, or it doesn't, or if a peace deal isn't even brokered with Putin, Hamish, there was talks from the Biden administration and from Trump's team that said to Ukraine that they should probably make the conscription age 18 as opposed to 25. It was 27, but then they got that down to 25 in April. You've spoken about conscription a lot in the UK, but what are your thoughts on this, with the US kind of weighing in on this conscription age, telling them that I would lower it if I were you?
Well, it's a really tricky one, but we think of this modern digital age and massive drones, all over the battlefield, that actually, manpower, soldiers are not as relevant as they used to be. But that would be a poor assumption to make. And the reason the Russians have stayed in it is that they've put so many soldiers in the front line. Reports that they've lost, well over 800,000, approaching 1 million soldiers dead and injured in this war is unbelievable. Now, the mass thing is key, and Ukraine needs to match that. Hitherto, Ukraine can't go to North Korea and buy soldiers as Putin is doing.
Yeah.
That there has been much talk about, the West or NATO countries in Europe getting involved, getting boots on the ground. And certainly if Trump pulls out and takes out American hardware, that is going to have to happen.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's up to the Ukraine to provide the capability at the moment. And we look back to the Second World War, in this country and Australia and everybody else who's fighting the Nazis, and conscription was down to those early years. I know that people in Ukraine are getting really tired with the war, and conscription is really just not a popular thing. But unfortunately, when the security of your nation is at stake, you've got to pull out all the stops. So, I think the Americans have got a point there that until we start having to put, British men and women into the front line, Ukraine needs to do all it can to make sure that doesn't happen. If that means reducing the conscription age, then they're going to have to do it.
Absolutely. Over to another war that we touched on earlier in the interview. A ceasefire deal is being brokered by, it's in Qatar right now, but the US are backing it, both the Trump and the Biden administration. Hamas has agreed to it, but the Israeli government is still kind of working through it. They're not quite sure as this interview goes on right now. Trump had said if a deal is not reached before his inauguration on January 20, that all hell would break loose. Now, if this is brokered before he's sworn in on Monday, is it a coincidence, or does Donald Trump actually, get to say this was me?
Well, I think for 99.9% of the world, we don't care. We just want a peace.
Yeah.
We want the fighting and the war to end. There, so many people have died on both sides. I'm sure that Trump and his team are involved in it anyway, but it is really fundamental. And when having just been in Syria, where it is actually the Israelis destroying Hezbollah, which has allowed the fall of the Assad regime. Now, hitherto, Syria and Israel have been warring factions, for years and years and years. But it's one got a feeling, and not just a feeling, but actually speaking to people in Damascus, that they realise that the Israeli action has allowed them to get rid of Assad. So, and also it is, that we thought the Middle East was going to explode before Christmas. Now, we've got peace in Syria at the moment. If we can get peace in Gaza, with Hezbollah and the other Iranian militias basically destroyed, this is a very good thing for the world. The most likely development of the war in the Middle East is almost a global war. Now, if that Gaza peace can come to fruition, then that diminishes hugely. And if Trump can also claim, a ceasefire and peace in Ukraine, then I think everybody will applaud it. We might not agree with everything else he says and does, but the last thing anybody wants is the continuation of these two dreadful conflicts.
We're going to move on to a kind of a peculiar story on the note of Trump. Now, he, for the last few years, has been adamant that he wants the United States to buy Greenland. Now, this is kind of bizarre to think that you can even do that. Now, obviously, Greenland has hit back saying absolutely not. It's obviously a Danish autonomous country. But why do you think Trump says it's an absolute necessity to the United States to acquire Greenland?
Well, Trump says a lot of quite incredible things. I think if you look at it geographically, you can sort of see why North America feels that Greenland is more part of North America than actually part of Europe, in its current context. But that when strategically, I suppose we understand there are a lot of natural resources there, and it is a very, very large piece of land. So if you are concerned about your defence, then it is a key block in the way there. But it seems a bit irrational to me for Trump to suggest that Greenland should be part of the States. I expect it is more of his, part of his narrative, part of his build-up to, coming into power as the US, and maybe it's to deflect things from elsewhere. I mean, we're all talking about Greenland, perhaps not. It's just, we're not talking so much about the fires in California, what is happening in Ukraine and elsewhere. So I think it may be a deflection technique to get people to look aside. And while we're looking at Greenland, other things are going on. And if he has brokered a Gaza ceasefire, if he does broker a Ukraine thing, then no doubt it's almost like a conjurer's sleight of hand. We were looking at Greenland, but no, the president was sorting out the world's problems in the Middle East and Europe.
How do you think such a bold claim like that is, I guess, foreshadowing the next 4 years for his second presidency?
Well, I think we got a real taste of President Trump in his first presidency. And admittedly, a lot of that was sort of covered by COVID and other activities. But if he can sort out the problems in the Middle East and in Ukraine, then actually it probably gives him quite a lot of leverage to do other things. And although I only know what I read in the media about him, it strikes me that what his real legacy would be is America once again, leading the way financially and economically and being, this massive powerhouse, and everybody in the States is rich and has their own private jet like Trump. It strikes me that, that can only happen if the US is not spending trillions of dollars a year on defense and can focus on sort of growth and economic development. So maybe I'm putting words into his mouth, but I'm sure Trump will surprise us, every month over the next 4 years.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thanks for having me.